Hello everyone! Today's video, we are going to talk about how to play the Vampiric Bloodline Precon from Crimson Vows without upgrading or modding the list at all. I really enjoy playing Precons in the Commander pods at my LGS, and you can have a lot of fun with them. By applying some of the thinking from CEDH, players are often surprised by how strong the Precons can be. If you're interested in picking up Vampiric Bloodline, I'm gonna share some tips on how I would pilot this deck. Yes. Let's begin with the main commander of the Precon, Strefan, Maurer Progenitor. Strefan is a 4-mana flying 3/2 vampire that continuously creates blood tokens for each player who lost life during your turn. This includes yourself. When you attack with Strefan, you can sacrifice 2 blood tokens and put a vampire card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking, and they're indestructible until the end of turn, so you can commit a creature and not be afraid that it'll die during combat. In CEDH, mulliganing your hand is the most important step and most important part of the game, and it's the same thing for playing this Precon. When you play Strefan, there are 2 things you want to look for in your mulligans. First, you want to have at least 3 lands or 4 mana's worth of mana producing cards like mana rocks in your opener so you can play Strefan reliably. Second, you want a vampire that can be played prior to turn 4 to allow Strefan to generate blood tokens by the time you cast him on turn 4. So this includes things like Blood Tithe Harvester, Cordial Vampire, Indulgent Aristocrat, anything that you can play on turn 1 to 3. You can also keep a hand with Crimson Honor Guard, as it can trigger each turn to create blood tokens with Strefan, or you can keep a hand with Glass Cast Heart, which generates a blood token whenever you attack with a vampire, and it fuels Strefan by causing life loss for yourself and making more beaters. If we're really lucky, this hand will also have a payoff like Bloodlord of Vasgoth, Butcher of Malakir, Markov Enforcer, Necropolis Regent, Anawan the Ruined Sage, Crossway Troublemakers, and more. Given that Strefan generates blood tokens that allow us to filter our hand, having the payoff is secondary to guaranteeing we get Strefan out as fast as we can, and also getting a source of damage to start getting those blood tokens. Seeing these mulligan requirements shows that the deck does not mulligan very well. Fantastic Precon commanders like Brina can be aggressively mulliganed because Brina's card draw and also lower mana cost. This means we can easily mull down to 5 or even 4 cards to try and find that turn 1 Soul Ring, or more mana rocks to land that turn 2 Brina. However, Strefan's higher cost and requirements to getting the blood token engine going means we aren't afforded the same luxuries. If you see a hand with 3 lands within your first 3 mulligans, I would not risk going any further. At worst, Strefan can always trigger himself by attacking an opponent in the air for 3 damage, so you want to consistently try and land Strefan on turn 4, or earlier if you're lucky with like a Soul Ring or something. Now that we know how to mull for Strefan to start the game, let's talk about the actual game plan for the Precon. Strefan is an aggressive deck that wants to snowball threats and build a board that wins through combat. You generally want to split your attacks so you can continuously build multiple blood tokens to continue dropping more vampires or using them to filter your hand. However, this deck can generate a lot more threat than other commanders at the table. The way it snowballs permanents and creatures is very visible to your opponents, and your board can be easily disrupted by your opponents working together to remove your payoffs. Strefan is also very similar to Kalia in how he can potentially cheat in big creatures, which is always intimidating and scary to your opponents, even if you're playing a Precon. Given how threatening and visible this deck is, it's important for you to scale your board to the pace of the pod. If you have a very powerful start and manage to have a commanding presence in the early game, you can risk committing further to eliminate opponents with board wipes or removal first. But if you don't feel confident in being able to end the game quickly with what you've drawn, then you need to learn how to turn your combat into politics. I published a video earlier on how to play aggro and commander, so you definitely want to check that out. But essentially, you want to position yourself as the tool that strikes down the most threatening player in the game. You want a board that can apply pressure, but not dominate the game, and hold up more creatures when the inevitable board wipe comes. Luckily, this list also comes with Sinister Waltz, meaning you can commit harder to your board and easily recover after a Wrath effect. You can also put down Timothar, Baron of Bats on the battlefield as a good way to pseudo-protect your board, as you can exile the most important vampires and turn them into bats that come back. For finishers, keep a lookout for cards like Mob Rule or Olivia's Wrath. Timing those spells properly will help you overtake the pod and hopefully win the game. Malakir Blood Witch is also another great way to end the game, as you can pressure your opponent's life totals without dealing lethal during combat, then play the Blood Witch post-combat and drain them all to death. Usually your opponents don't really care until they're like one alpha strike away from dying, so the Blood Witch is a good way to kind of get around that. Late in the game, Glasscast Heart is also another great finisher to drain 13 life away from your opponents for essentially 5 mana if you manage to stockpile enough blood tokens. Some cards to pay attention to includes Midnight Arsonist, a fantastic mid-game vampire that would heavily set back an artifact-based deck if you have a large enough board of vampires. Patron of the Vein also stops any combo that involves recurring creatures from the graveyard, as Patron of the Vein exiles them. Arterial Alchemy turns all your blood tokens into equipment, meaning you can potentially just suit up Strefan with a bunch of blood blades and Voltron your opponents to death. It's also a great play after you cast Strefan, as you can play this on turn 5, create 3 blood tokens, then attack of Strefan to drop a vampire. Molten Echoes, Stensia Masquerade, and Necropolis Regent are great ways to grow your board of vampires, but don't forget, Molten Echoes also creates fuel for cards like Indulgent Aristocrat to sacrifice post-combat. Lastly, you can always leverage the Madness ability on some cards in the deck with the blood tokens. This means you can leave mana open, and when your opponent attacks you with the creature you want removed, you can crack a blood token and madness something like Stromkirk Occultist or Anya's Ravager to block it. If you open with a card like Falconwrath Gorger, it essentially allows you to play all your vampires at instant speed, granted you have the additional 2 mana to crack the blood token. So, Strefan is an amazing commander for players who are not afraid to play aggressively and like to build up a board of tribal synergies. Being able to generate blood tokens through your commander means it's going to be very easy to build up a lethal momentum, but to truly succeed with Strefan, you will need to learn how to control the optics of your board, sequence your finishers at the right times, and politic your way to victory. For players who don't want to play such an aggressive game, I would recommend playing Loreen and Camber, which are the partners that came in the 99 of the list. I hope this guide was useful for you. I'm very excited to try this deck out at my LGS. And if you've played it and you have more tips, drop it in the comment box below for everyone else to see. Next time we're gonna do Millicent, the Spirit deck.